Hello everyone, JD here. This presentation is about interest groups. Let's get started. Examine the role of lobbyists in the democratic process. Discuss the respective works of David Truman and Manker Olson, including how the latter challenges the former. Identify the factors that contributed to an increasing number of interest groups active in our political system, and differentiate between the insider and outsider tactics used by interest groups to influence policy development. We're going to start with an excerpt. This is taken from Federalist Paper number 10 by James Madison, who eventually went on to become president. All right. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an element without which it instantly expires. But it could be not less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. All right. Two key words I would take out of this: liberty, faction. Think about this for a second. If you care about an issue, or you could call it a cause, there's a really good chance that there's an organization out there working on it that you could join. And if there isn't, you could found your own. What makes that possible? Well, we have a First Amendment. We have the right of assembly. We have the right of speech. You can find people who think similarly to yourself. You can form a group or join a group. And then you can try to put pressure on government to essentially enact laws that reflect whatever your values happen to be, right? And so when you think about liberty, that's about the Constitution, specifically like the First Amendment here. When I think about faction, I think about a nonprofit organization. We have what are called 501c3s and 501c4s in this country. That is an IRS, Internal Revenue Service designation, which means, let's say you donate money to a 501c3, it's tax deductible, which means you can claim it when you do your taxes. But the reason why I bring this up is because the faction is the organization working on the issue. And the political system that we have, rights are very, very important in the United States, individual rights. And that means that you have the opportunity, you're afforded this opportunity to go out there and make the world better reflect your values if you care enough about an issue, right? So think about it. If you want to read Federalist Paper number 10 in its entirety, you can click on the link in the bottom right-hand corner, take you to the Library of Congress website where you can read this primary source. That's briefly a little overview. And really, it's foreshadowing of what we're going to talk about in the rest of this presentation, the slides that are going to follow. Okay? So let's talk more about interest groups. The logic of lobbying. People who want to influence government decisions recognize the advantages of banding together with others of like mind. People who think similarly to yourself. Governments, for their part, have good reason to welcome lobbying. These are appeals from citizens and groups for favorable policies. I mean, that's what a democratic republic allows you to do. If there is a concern you have, whether it be city government, you can go and talk to, for example, in Carson City, you can go and talk to the Board of Supervisors and the mayor. Or Carson City School District, maybe you're concerned about curriculum matters, whatever, you can go and talk to them, or maybe extracurricular activities. Or your state government, we're very fortunate because Carson City, we have the legislative building, and every other year we have lawmakers. They'll convene for 120 days, which is when they're in session, right? Or in Washington, D.C. And it's not just Congress. It could be an executive agency, right? And also, I really think when we talk about like even the Supreme Court, there are groups, and I'll talk more about this later in the presentation on the judiciary, is that groups can file what are called, well, some people pronounce it amicus and some people pronounce it amicus briefs, which is you're not a party in the case, but you're interested in the outcome, and you can file an amicus brief with the Supreme Court, encouraging them to take up the case to hear it. So you can look at that as a form of advocacy, in my professional opinion, right? So anyhow, we want to talk a bit about this. So appeals from citizens and groups for favorable policies. You want this government to be responsive to your thoughts, your opinions. if you have a position on an issue and you think it really matters and people need to hear it, well, you can go and you can lobby, which means you can go and make contact with people. You can go to their office and you can meet with them, or you could call their office on the phone, or, they take on a wide variety of different approaches. But the point I want to make here is you're trying to get government to act in ways that are consistent with your values. You're trying to shape the laws that are enacted. Officials cannot estimate the costs and benefits of alternative actions without having some idea how people will react to their initiatives. Of course, whether you are I like to make it three categories. We say elected, appointed, or just hired. And you could look at being elected or appointed as being hired, but really there's three different ways of getting into office. People either have to vote for you, you win enough of them, you get the position in government. Someone else in government chooses you, and then you go through the proper process and you're actually confirmed, where you're appointed and confirmed, you get the position in government. Or it could be an office which you're just hired. Like many cities have what are called a city manager, and that position is oftentimes hired. But I bring this up for a reason. People get into office different ways, but they have to be mindful of what we think about what they're doing. If they don't pay attention to what we think, there's a really good chance that folks are either going to vote them out come the next election cycle. They're going to demand someone be removed if they happen to be appointed, or they could just very well get fired. And really, you could look at losing your elected position or losing an appointment as being fired. But really, like I said, there are these three different categories that I like to mention here. Okay, so they have to be mindful of what it is we want. All governments need information, whether it be political or technical. We'll get into more of this later, that people and organizations are in the best position to provide. Try to accommodate the people who command valuable electoral resources. That's votes, money, organizational structures, and skills. And at least a few officials have been willing to trade favors for gifts of every sort. And yeah, that's a very gray area, because when it comes to influencing people, at what point have you crossed the line, and does it look like it's actual corruption, where it's like a quid pro quo? I give you this, and then you're going to do that for me. So we got to be very careful there. And there are rules. Okay. I do want to say this, though, before we move on from this slide. People who end up in government by one of the three ways that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, they're looking to keep their jobs. They're supposed to be responsive to us, to our needs, right? That's how a democratic republic is supposed to function. So always keep that in mind. Modern politics breed professional lobbyists. All right? People hire agents to represent them before legislatures and executive agencies. Now, I will say this. You need people who are adept at navigating an institution. And the reason being is because there are rules, procedures, and customs that a lot of folks, like everyday people, don't know much about, right? And if your goal is to get policy enacted, well, then you have to be as effective as possible, which means you need someone who understands how it all works. So understand how institutions work and enjoy warm personal relationships. So part of it is, how does this function? What's the process, the steps, right? But other part of this is the relationships that you're able to build with people. In other words, you want them to know who you are so that they trust you, and they're more likely to take information that you're going to make available to them that they could use to help make a decision. Merged with modern representative government and has flourished with the growing scope and complexity of governmental activities. Yes, I will say this. The government in 2023-24 is far more complicated than the government of 1791. So much has changed. I mean, one major example of this is in the late 19th century, we had the official professionalization of our Congress, our Senate, and our House of Representatives, which means, early in the Republic, people would go and serve a term or two and then they go home. because it was perceived as a public service. Now people will serve multiple terms. And we do not currently have term limits for either the House of Representatives or the Senate, which means people can be in there for decades, plural. And the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot that's going to change. And you need people who know what's going on there, right? Interest groups spend billions more every cycle on lobbying than they do on campaign contributions. You'll often hear about campaign contributions, but when you have a professional lobbyist, that person is usually making a pretty healthy salary, right? So any kind of, well, not just the salary benefits that they receive in their position, but also the nature of the work they're doing, because they're going to have to travel, they're going to have to meet with various folks. I mean, you also think about this too. People go and, I mean, any lobbyists I've ever seen, professional lobbyists, they're usually well-dressed, very well-dressed. I mean, when I've been over at the legislative building here in Carson City during the session, I've seen people, because they're required to identify as lobbyists. And the folks are usually, I mean, they're usually very well dressed. They present well. They articulate their thoughts. I mean, they're pretty sophisticated folks, right? There's a lot that goes into that and making it happen. And it's also going to require, like 8 to 5 business hour type work. But then there's also going to be, if you're going to be lobbying people, you could be meeting in the evenings, weekends, and so forth, because remember, you're going to have to find different avenues by which you can communicate your ideas to people serving in government, like members of Congress. Right? Okay, so I want to add this. So lobbying is the costliest route. Very presence, not to mention political success they achieve, raises suspicion. All right. Special interests win at the expense of the public interest. Now, I want to say this too. Every election cycle that I've been paying attention, which is quite a few of them, maybe I should rephrase that. I'm going to rephrase because I don't necessarily like to use absolutes. Let's put it like this. Many election cycles, you'll hear the term special interest thrown around. And it's typically negative. But think of it like this. If you cared about a cause, like let's say you cared about climate change, or let's say you cared about gun rights, and you were out there actively lobbying on these issues, you would be a special interest. And there's lots of people. I mean, I've done this work. I've lobbied in Washington, D.C. I've gone and walked the halls of Congress before. And I've lobbied, here in Carson City. I've lobbied when I lived in Illinois. And to be very honest, I wasn't giving anyone any money. I was just sitting down, sometimes with a congressional staffer, like a congressional aide, to explain this is what we think about this issue and why the congressperson should vote the following way on it. Or this is why we think the city ought to do the following, or we think that the county ought to do the following. I mean, I've lobbied all kinds of people. And you could do just the same. Anyone listening to this presentation could lobby elected officials if you wanted to, or appointed, hired officials. You could do this. And you wouldn't necessarily be engaged in any nefarious activity. But there seems to be this suspicion around lobbying for whatever reason. Because there's a belief that the people who are doing more of it, or the most amount of it, have a lot of money to offer, and they have some kind of undue influence on the process itself. But successful lobbying subverts principles of democratic equality and majority rule. At least this is a concern of why a lot of people think it's negative. And groups vary in wealth and how readily they can be organized, creating marketed imbalances in representation. Sure, think of it like this. Business interests, they usually are very well financed. That's not the same as if, like, let's say you care about animal protection or environmental degradation or whatever issue it is that you're invested in, that you're like, oh, I'm really worried about this. We got to take action on this. And so if you're really interested in those issues, there's not nearly as much money behind them as there is for business interests that are at work. Okay. So there's concern people have. And sometimes those people get what they want, but let's be honest too. I mean, think about this. Remember the civil rights movement? If you've taken a U.S. history class, you know a bit about the civil rights movement. Well, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65 didn't happen by accident. It happened because people were putting pressure on government to make changes because we were not living up to our bedrock principles. And we needed to extend more protection to people, in this particular case, people of color who've been historically marginalized and mistreated. So it's important for us to remember this. There are instances where social movements have been very successful at securing policy results or policy changes. All right. It's not just wealthy people. All right. The origins of interest group politics in the United States. The pluralist defense of interest groups. With the emergence of stable political associations, scholars began to study. Now, when I think about this, I immediately think about Federalist Paper number 10, which we've already briefly mentioned earlier in this presentation, which I would encourage you to read. And I want to add this, since we're talking about this pluralist defense. To maintain freedoms specified in the First Amendment, a political system must tolerate factions even though they may be opposed to the public good. Organizations of all kinds are licensed by the Constitution and can be suppressed only by violating its principles. We take this back to Federalist 10. The only way you could ever stop people from forming different groups on the basis of what they believe in is by taking people's freedom to do this. And we don't believe in that because the freedom to assemble is very much a part of the American grain, right? So, systematic defense of their legitimate role in a modern democracy. Case made fully by political scientist David Truman. He viewed proliferation of groups as a natural consequence of economic development. I want to add this too. Think about it. We live in an industrialized society. It has a very elaborate division of labor. And that's tied into this when we say economic development. There's a lot of people out there engaged in a lot of activity, and there's a lot of money to be made. And also, workers make this possible. So then the question is, which interests are going to manifest, or how are we going to see, how I could phrase this differently. There's a series of ideas and people are going to start to coalesce. They'll come together and they'll say, okay, you know what? We need to take action on this. What do you think, Jim? What do you think, Cheryl? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And then people will, oh yeah, we need to do something about it. Well, what does this something mean? Because something's really vague. Well, we need to protest. We need to write letters. We need to go vote, we need to vote people. Of course, you always have the election process. You can vote better candidates into office. People can do that. But that means you got to wait another 2, 4, or 6 years, depending on where you are in an election cycle. So yes, you can vote people in, but what are you going to do in the meantime? You can't just wait for the next election cycle to come around, right? So you could protest. You can make phone calls. You can go to someone's office and explain to them why you think they ought to do the following, okay? But our economy is very complicated. And I would zoom out and I would say, it's not just the economy that's complicated, it's the society that's complicated for a variety of reasons. Groups formed whenever shared interests were threatened or enhanced by political action. Of course, if you like what's going on, you want it to continue. If you don't like what's going on, you want it to stop. And naturally, people are going to want to say, hey, what should we do here? Right? As society became more fragmented and variegated, so did universe of associations. This goes back to the point about living in a country of 330 plus million people. They don't all agree. They never have, they never will. And so people are going to find ways to make their communities better reflect their values. Right? Groups were free to organize and participate in an open political system. The political process balanced competing interests, as James Madison promised. So what I normally do in an on-campus class is I will write at the top of the board, on the whiteboard, I'll write, political system. And then I'll choose an issue, pick climate change, gun control, whatever it is, or gun rights. And then what I'll do is I'll draw a series of circles, and the circles are all varying sizes. And I look at it like this. Each one of these circles on the board represents an organization working on the issue of climate change or gun rights or whatever. Some of them have more members. Some of them have fewer members. Some of them take in more money in donations. Some of them take in less money in donations, right? Some of them have more influence over the process, and some of them have less influence over the process. But the hope is that different groups will be counteracting the efforts of others. And you think about it, it's a system predicated upon compromise. No one person gets all of what they want. Yes, some people are more influential than others, but no one usually gets all of what they want. Typically, when a bill is authored or written down, it's going to go through some changes if it even does get, or before it actually gets enacted, right? So a bill rarely is going to go in a single form or just one form. There's going to be amendments, changes made to it, because not everyone's going to agree. And so the hope is, when you think about Federalist Paper number 10 and James Madison's ideas here, the hope is that within this system, no one group is going to ever have too much, or no one group is ever going to have too much influence or dominate everyone else, because there are other people organizing against them. So people are working in some cases together, in other cases against one another, but still, the hope is the process will end up with the best policies enacted, because it will reflect what at least hopefully a majority of people want. I think this is theoretical, of course. Okay, so adding to this, demands provoke counter demands, and policies embodied compromises and trade-offs. Yes, this goes back to the point of no one gets all of what they want, because think about that. It really comes down to human relationships. I think if you are able to distill this, human relationships, we build them all the time. What can we get from them? And when people in office look to you for information, you provide it, assuming you're working with one of these groups on one of these causes, right? That's important to mention here. But no matter how good your information, no matter how much you believe in the issue or the position that you hold on the issue, there are going to be other people who disagree. You just have to keep that in mind. That's the nature of how it works. Aware that overreaching would stir opposition, groups moderated their demands. Okay. Continued. Regarded as essential or valuable participants in democratic politics, with other participation, policy will be made in far greater ignorance of what citizens wanted. There's a couple of examples here: environmental protection and animal rights. We talk about oh no, I'm getting ahead of myself. Hold on a second here. I need to go to, yes, it helps if I go to the proper page. I've looked at the wrong slide. My mistake, folks. Okay. All right, let's start over. Regarded as essential or valuable participants in democratic politics. Without their participation, policy would be made in far greater ignorance of what citizens wanted. The Sunny conception is open to criticism. And by Sunny conception, we're talking about Truman's position here. Groups visibly active didn't form a balanced cross-section of economic and social interests. And secondly, some are overrepresented, others weren't represented. Overrepresented, the example given, corporations. Weren't represented, example given, migrant laborers. And another point I want to make here is power and resources possessed by lobbyists tend to reflect the power that the groups they represent have in society. And it's true, some have more, others have less. So then it begs the question, how much influence will they have on the process itself? Right? The problem of collective action. Explanation for bias in group representation lies in the way incentives for collective action and barriers to organization vary across different types. Enter The Logic of Collective Action by Manker Olson, Harvard University Press, 1965. This is a very important work. It illuminates some challenges that arise whenever you're working with other people on, let's say, your cause. Classical pluralists mistaken in assuming people would form interest groups to promote or defend shared interests. Someone had to take on the work of organizing the group and finding the resources to keep it going. Right? Remember, classical pluralist is like a David Truman. So we have Manker Olson's ideas challenging Truman's a bit here. Organizers have to overcome a standard collective action problem, free riding. Now, I'll give you some examples of free riding. Let's say you watch PBS, but you don't donate, or you listen to KUNR, which is the NPR affiliate at the University of Nevada, Reno, but you don't donate. Technically, that would make you a free rider. Let's say you join a group, and I'm putting that in air quotes. You can't see me right now, but I'm putting it in air quotes. You join a group, but you really don't do anything. You don't go to any of their events. You don't make any donations in terms of money. You don't volunteer in any capacity, but you get the newsletter. Well, technically, it's free riding. And we've all had an experience with this. Have you ever had a small group activity you've had to complete in school where, let's say, there's 5 of you in the group, but there's always one person who can't be bothered? You text them, they don't respond. You try to arrange meetings, they don't show up. You call them, it goes right to voicemail. And then when you ask them for whatever component they're supposed to have done for the group project, they don't have it finished. Well, guess what? That's an example of a free rider. It's a real challenge, but there is some good news here. Typically, the smaller the group, the greater the likelihood you'll be able to secure better participation because there's that social force at work. So poses more of a challenge to some interests than others, with the scale of the group and the stakes of its involvement in public policy determining whether its members are likely to work together toward their common goal. When I've done a lot of advocacy work in my adult life, I used to divide up the labor and then make sure people had specific tasks to complete. And then there's like, with this relatively small organization, you have the ability to put pressure on people. And I mean that politely. I'm not trying to threaten anyone, but put pressure on people to get their task completed so that you can advance the issue. You can advance the cause and, complete the task that you're working on. And people typically, if you have a relationship with them, they want to, they really want to be helpful. So I didn't run into too many problems, but I will say this: the larger the organization, the greater the likelihood you're going to run into the free rider problem because people just disappear. Oh, don't you worry, we're going to get to that. And like, where'd they go? Oh, they left. So it's been known to happen. Small groups are easier to organize than large groups, and people with great deal at stake are more readily organized for political action. I also want to add this too. When we say at stake, we have prospective costs and benefits of policy. So when we say what's at stake, the prospective costs and benefits of the policy. In other words, what's it going to take for us to get it, and what are we going to get once it's done if we're able to get it through, right? And yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that. Striking changes in the interest group universe. Proliferation of organizations claiming to represent millions of citizens devoted to some version of the public interest. The first example is moral incentives. Personal satisfaction of active self-expression trump the economist's concept of rationality for concerned citizens. Now, I want to say this. Examples would be environmental protection and animal rights. I also want to add, most put together by enterprising activists supported by charitable foundations, wealthy individuals, the government itself. They're sustained by dues and small contributions from a larger number of private citizens. Right? You believe in it, so you join. Maybe you pay membership dues and occasionally make an additional donation. That's more or less where I'm coming from. And I don't get into talking about my causes because that's no one's business. And you're going to have your causes. We all have our own individual causes or issues that we care about in a group that we might be likely to support, right? But here's my point. That's been more or less my motive for being involved. There's the moral incentives. Like if I care about an issue, I get involved because I believe in it. And yeah, it costs me energy, time, and money. But the hope is you're going to, once again, make the community better reflect your values for having gotten involved. Then we also have what are called selective incentives. Benefits that can be denied to individuals who don't join or contribute. Now, Many of us act rationally. We want some kind of concrete benefit for our membership. The American Automobile Association, also known as AAA, perhaps you've heard of this, AAA. AAA lobbies Congress for vehicle safety and gas prices. Majority of members, for them, it's a way to get roadside assistance, maps, discounts at hotels, right? So AAA is working on what's important to the organization, but they're also giving these, I guess you could say, little benefits to the people who join the membership that I just listed here, right? So there's a big difference between the moral incentives and the selective incentives. Right. So let's move on to contemporary interest groups. Why have interest groups proliferated? There are interacting factors. Social fervent, initiated by the civil rights movement and continued by the Reagan-era conservative and right-to-life movements, inspired or instructed stream of organizations that agitate for social change. We can go back and we can talk about, there's a whole bunch of causes in the mid to later part of the 20th century. We could talk about the anti-war movement, focused specifically on Vietnam. We could talk about the civil rights movement and also women's rights, environmentalism. And there's, the consumer protection movement. There's a whole bunch of them, right? We bring this up for a reason. And the reason is, I want to take a look at this real quickly. All right, 5. Okay, I just want to make sure I'm in the right place here. We bring this up for a reason, because all these types of organizations are trying to influence the laws that are enacted, or trying to support or defeat, however you want to phrase it. We bring this up for a reason. Growing and increasingly well-educated and affluent middle class with a surplus of money and time to invest in causes that excite the moral imagination. Think about it like this. If you're college educated and you're working an 8-to-5 job somewhere, you're going to have more free time. Your evenings, your weekends. You can join one of these organizations. You can donate to them. You can go out to the events they host and so forth. But having gone to school, being more aware of them, and then caring about the issue that they work on goes a long way. I mean, you're helping advance the cause through your involvement. And so you also need to be thinking about this. There's technical innovation that's occurred, right? And I want to bring this up because it's really important. Think about email, social media, and of course, websites, databases. They become more sophisticated. Now, I was born in 1973. I think this 20th century wave of these organizations started before I was born. Probably a decade, maybe a decade and a half before I was born. This wave. It's not the first time it's ever happened, but certainly it's one of the multiple waves that we've seen in U.S. history that I'm mentioning here. But technical innovation has also changed the game, because think about this. Having a website. Well, you can just go on, log on to the internet, and then you can go and you can look, okay, which organizations out there are working on this cause that I care about? How can I get involved? What do they need me to do? They need to call a member of Congress. They need some kind of a small donation. Are they hosting an event in my community or somewhere nearby in Reno or somewhere, Sacramento? What could I travel to actually attend, and so forth? But point being is this. If you're going to go attend an event on a Saturday, well, think about it. It's probably because you're working an 8-to-5 job. You know about it because you're college educated. You've got the free time to go. You've got the money to donate if you decide to do that. You've got the knowledge of the issue. You're out there learning about it. You care about it. You're invested, right? And it's never been easier because the internet makes it all so accessible, right? Successful groups inspire opponents and imitators. Corporate business leaders whose interests were threatened by the political gains of environmental and consumer groups. That's the example we're giving here. There have been a number of organizations or interest groups that have cropped up over the years in response to this wave that I've just mentioned. And some of them include Hoover Institution, which is at Stanford University, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute. They're usually more right-leaning, industry-associated groups. In other words, they're usually pushing more right-leaning ideas because they typically champion free markets and they don't like regulation. And if you think about this, if you're involved with either environmental or consumer protection, that usually involves regulation of industry. Well, industry eventually started to push back and say, well, we don't like you having too much control in this process. We would like to be able to have the opportunity to make money. And if people don't want to buy our products, don't buy our products. But as long as they're buying the products, the consumers have spoken, or people have spoken. So we have private business or private industry pushing back against the environmental and consumer protection movements. Okay. And I just mentioned some of those groups doing that. All right. Federal government contributed through the tax code. Many groups qualify as nonprofit organizations, which are exempt from most taxes. And also, not only are the groups exempt from taxes, but you get to claim that as a deduction in your own taxes if you make a donation to a 501c3. Remember that I mentioned earlier is an IRS, Internal Revenue Service designation. Donors may deduct contributions to nonprofit groups from taxable income. Okay, there we go. There's that. Let's see here. They're also going to rise in defense of government programs. Typically, groups benefiting from government programs get involved and active only after programs are in place. Oh, and what I would say is this. We have American Association of Retired Persons working on Social Security and Medicare. Both Social Security and Medicare are government programs, and people have an interest in seeing them continue. So they want that to happen. And so AARP monitors that. Okay. Oh, I'll also add this too, just popped into my mind. Back during George W. Bush's administration, he, and not just he, advisors wanted to reform Social Security and make it, at least in part, a private investment account. AARP came out strongly against that. And so the idea just disappeared because there wasn't enough public support to continue advocating for it. All right. Fragmentation and specialization. New organizations form when new issues pull old groups apart. I'm going to give you an example. Here's farm policy. Today, more than 200 organizations attempt to shape agricultural policy, or shall I say agriculture policy. And you can see the examples given. I also want to mention here before I move on, there's a concept called an iron triangle. Imagine a triangle. Close your eyes. Think of a triangle. At the top of the triangle is the American Farm Bureau. Go down from the top to the right corner, bottom of the triangle, members of Congress. And then go to the left, to the other corner of the triangle, Department of Agriculture. So what you have here is some type of organization outside of government interacting with members of our legislature who are elected. And then there's also, when you talk about the Department of Agriculture, you're talking about the executive branch because that's one of those agencies. Okay, so that's what's called an iron triangle. And they have a relationship with one another because this is how policymaking gets done. Medical research, bodily organs, disease. Here are your examples. All want the health research budget to grow, but each works to expand share. Right? To survive, an interest group must convince its individual or institutional backers that they continue that their continued investment is worthwhile. Sorry for the typo. Their continued investment is worthwhile. To avoid destructive poaching, competitors reach informal accommodations. Right. Okay, let's get into another topic or subtopic. What do interest groups do? Insider tactics, trafficking in information and cultivating access. Information is inherently suspect, for it is intended to persuade. I know this from my own advocacy work because when you go to meet with an elected official, you sit down, and I sat down in mayor's offices. I did this in Rockford, Illinois at one point. I did this in DeKalb, Illinois. I sat down with a village president in McChesney Park, Illinois. And you can just tell sometimes by the way they receive the information, their body language. Because you're there because of the position. Let's back up. You're there because you care about the issue and you have a specific position on it that you're trying to get them to agree with or act upon. So they'll appreciate, on some level, they'll appreciate the contribution you're making to the process. However, there's nothing to say that just because they're listening to you for 15 minutes that they're inclined to agree. I've also met with like a county chair. Met with a bunch of different officials over the years. All right, so there's that. Thus, much of what goes on between lobbyists and officials is aimed at establishing sufficient trust to permit mutually beneficial exchanges. This is about relationships. Lobbyists spend a lot of time keeping in touch with officials. And you're doing this for specific reasons. Much of the work lies in responding to proposals or actions. Keeping in touch facilitates cordial relations with the officials they might do business with someday. Think about it like this. A person is more inclined to listen to friends than strangers. Now, are you necessarily going to become their friend? No. But being their acquaintance is better than being a stranger, because at least they have some familiarity with you. You will have met them. You will have talked with them. You will have shared your views with them. Okay, so that's important to mention there. Gather intelligence by reading newspapers and various publications. Decision makers need two types of information: political and technical. I mentioned this earlier, so I'm going to come back to it. So here we are. Political. Whenever possible, they frame proposals in terms of consistent with prevailing currents of public opinion. What does the average everyday person think about it? Remember, people serving in office typically want to keep their position. So you got to be mindful. If you were to advocate or express a view on an issue that is highly unpopular, it could do damage to your political future. So you have to be mindful of that. And that's where sometimes they conduct polls to demonstrate support. What are people thinking? If they're not warm to an idea, then you're probably not going to want to go anywhere near it. And you're not going to go near it if you're facing an election in a year or two. It's dangerous. Okay, technical. Arrange for scientists or scholars to testify at congressional committee hearings to back claims with evidence from more neutral sources. This is something that's very, very important. I think about this, like my role as an academic. I'm just going to give you this example. There is research out there, because I've read the articles, that indicates that when groups file amicus briefs with the Supreme Court, there's an increased likelihood the court will call up the case. And remember, Supreme Court doesn't have to look at cases. There are thousands of appeals and every year, right? Thousands of appeals. And remember, the court's in session from October through June. There are thousands of appeals. They get to pick. They look at maybe on average 100, give or take. Right? More than likely, if you appeal your case, it's not going to get heard. But there's evidence, political science evidence, statistical analyses that indicate that if there's a bunch of amicus briefs on a specific case, the court will look at it. So that's the kind of technical data I'm mentioning here. Because think about it. When we're talking about issues like gun control or climate change, people are going to want to look at what academics have found. Because in my world, we're not interested in the politics. This might be political science, but I'm just telling you this. When you do statistical analysis, you either do or don't find a relationship between variables. Whatever I might happen to believe doesn't matter. Whatever causes I'm passionate about doesn't matter. It's like when people are doing research in a laboratory, either the medication they've developed treats or cures an illness, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you can't make it so. And to claim otherwise would be fraudulent, right? So if you're testing medication, the medication helps people, okay, then we get to move forward. But if it doesn't help people, if it doesn't do anything to counteract a condition, if it doesn't make people's lives better, if it doesn't, either improve the way they're feeling or cure whatever they're stricken with, you got to go on. You got to find you got to develop some other drugs to test, right? And so I bring this up for a reason. It's possible that elected officials would be interested in talking to, research scientists or social scientists because we want to know what the data tells us. And the data, in my professional opinion, should not be manipulated for political reasons. I mean, that's not going to stop a politician from cherry picking. Well, I like this study and that study. I don't like this study or that study. So you pick the ones you like, you ignore the ones you don't. My mindset as an academic is we look at all of them regardless of what our opinions might be about them, because each one of those studies is like a puzzle piece. And that's the technical side of this, whether it's in the hard sciences or the social sciences. Okay. And occasionally, these people are asked to testify at hearings to share their knowledge. Okay. Politicians grant access to people who can help them achieve their own goals. Officials always have more things to do than they have time to do them. Of course, if you think about a person's to-do list, when I was in Congress, or when I was lobbying in Congress, let's qualify, I was never served in Congress. When I was lobbying in Congress, it seemed like there was a lot of activity in that office we visited. When I've been over here to lobby at the legislative building in Carson City, the persons whose office I sat down in, they were incredibly busy. So there's so much going on. And as meaningful as you want to make your career, or whatever your intentions might happen to be, you're probably not going to get to everyone or everything because it isn't possible. And I know that sounds maybe troubling to some folks, but it's true. It's like I make a to-do list. I enjoy making to-do lists, and then checking it off as I go because I get to see the progress, which is what I've told people to do who are taking online classes. Look at your syllabus as like a ready reference, and then treat the course schedule as like a checklist. You can just go through and put a line through every item as you do them, the assignments, right? You can visually see your progress, the progress you're making across the summer session or semester or whenever you're listening to this. Okay, so bring it up for a reason. In any given day, I might want to get to 5 tasks, but maybe I only get to 3 of them, and then the other 2 get bumped to the next day. I get to as many as possible. But you're only in office for so long. You're only in session for so long. So there you go. Helping officials plan legislative strategy. Assemble legislative coalitions, draft legislation, organize hearings, and write rules and regulations. Think of it like this. A group that is in the know about a specific issue can actually help craft policies, which makes life so much easier for people who are in office because they're already so busy, tying it back to the point just above. Right? Here's a political cartoon. A little cynical here, but it communicates a point. When it comes to buying an elected official, make sure to select the right one. Last slide. Outsider tactics. Altering the political forces may take the form of implicit or explicit threats, persuade politicians to act as the group desires by altering forces they feel obliged to heed. So you're applying pressure there. Here are some common tactics aimed at putting issues on the agenda. Use of mass media to shape public opinion. Demonstrations, for example, a march intended to focus public attention on the cause. You need media attention for a protest, demonstration, march, whatever it is you're doing. You need it because then it communicates your ideas to thousands of people. And those people might be interested in what you're doing, right? Grassroots lobbying. Mobilize members to send messages that reiterate the group's demands to the representatives and senators. Okay, I also want to add this before I move on from this section, is that certain tactics like demonstrations, marches, protests have been historically used by a wide variety of different causes, like groups operating within a specific social movement. For example, the suffragists, they protested outside of the White House during Woodrow Wilson's administration just over 100 years ago to get women the right to vote across the whole country, because women could vote in some states in some elections, but the right didn't exist in the US Constitution for everyone everywhere. And so Alice Paul and others, they were very aggressive with that, helping secure constitutional amendment. All right. And lastly, politicians are far more resentful of outsider lobbying tactics than insider ones. This is where we're going to stop. Thank you so much for listening. Peace.